Nearshoring has the potential to drive new rounds of investment-oriented market and trade facilitation reforms in host countries as they seek to compete for supply chain inclusion. And CIPE strongly believes that when supported by rule of law, forward-looking effective regulatory frameworks, and active collaboration between governments and business, trade has the potential to bring economic opportunity to people all over the world and in all strata of business. Realigning supply chains that will function and remain stable as the global economy reels, rocks, and attempts to right itself will require inquiry into a broad range of complex topics, not least of these being the regulations governing the rapidly changing landscape of the digital economy and the new policies being put in place regarding cross-border trade. This is a formidable task, and I'm so grateful to those boldly taking it on. I want to thank our panelists, Marianne, Maria, and Nicole, for the insights they'll be sharing with us, as well as Raul, who heads up the trade team here at CIPE and is organizing this conversation. So right now, I'll hand this over to Raul Perales, who's going to moderate today's event. Raul, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andrew, and thanks everyone for joining us today in this conversation. Indeed, as Andrew was saying, a lot has been said about the way the pandemic has affected global trade, both in terms of who was trading, for example, shifts in trading partners, questions of nearshoring, reshoring, questions of vulnerabilities based on dependence on single exporters or single sources for goods, especially China, and the diversification away from China. Questions of competition between regions like Southeast Asia, Mexico, etc. But we've also been seeing things about how trading is being done or is being carried out. So we're talking about how countries, companies, especially governments, are moving to digital and automation in order to process cross-border transactions, a renewed emphasis on risk management, and we're also seeing an explosion of e-commerce. And all of this happening in a trade, in the midst of a trade landscape that itself was changing, right? Because of the China-U.S. confrontation on trade, because of the new USMCA, Brexit, realignments happening at the WTO, and a general sense of uncertainty with respect to the international trading landscape. So after 5 months of living with COVID-19, and seeing how the pandemic has affected the global economy, we want to understand what practices, what about these changes that we've seen are things that will, for lack of a better term, stick or stay with us for a very long time, versus what kinds of things we think are temporary adjustments or ways of absorbing the shock of the pandemic. And especially how all of this is likely to affect the choices companies and governments make regarding trade and trade policy. And to walk us through this discussion, I have the honor of introducing, counting with a fantastic panel of 3 well-seasoned experts on international trade, risk, and supply chains. In no particular order, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Marianne Rowden, who is President and CEO of the American Association of Exporters and Importers. And I thank her for taking time from her annual conference to join us for this conversation. The Honorable Nicole Lamb-Hale, who is the Managing Director at Kroll and former Assistant Secretary for Manufacturing and Services in the U.S. Department of Commerce's International Trade Administration. And last but not least, Camila Moreno, who is the Executive Director of the Free Trade Zone Association of the Americas, based in Bogota, Colombia. Ladies, thank you so much for joining us today. I want to start with Marianne, whose members span perhaps the most comprehensive arch of the international trade community in private sector. Marianne, perhaps can you get us started on, or telling us a little bit, where do your members stand on some of these shocks that we have seen with respect to COVID-19 and the adaptations that they have been making with respect to the vulnerabilities in terms of supply chains and other uncertainties happening in the international trading system as the pandemic hit us?
Thanks, Raul. And if we could bring the slide presentation, I'll just set our framework in place. AI did a study, and as Raul indicated, AI's members encompass the entire supply chain, both in terms of manufacturers, importers, exporters, which are mostly multinational Fortune 500 companies, but also the customs lawyers, export control lawyers, customs brokers, and the carriers. So go to the next slide, please. This shows we did a survey of our members, and we tried to get a snapshot of 3 weeks within the initial point of the pandemic. And as you see, the weeks that we chose to ask the same questions in a 3-week period was March 16th to the 20th, then March 27th to 23rd to 27th, and then March 30th to April 3rd. And, you know, what we found is overwhelming majority in week 1 were affected, and then 100% of our members were affected by the virus in week 2. For most respondents, the biggest impact was the supply chain with China. Next slide, please. So here we're talking about a clear majority of companies were impacted by an economic slowdown. There were some companies, the manufacturing plants, that actually just shut down. There are a myriad of impacts that slowdown has had on members. Delays in the resupply of product from source country was the biggest one, and then the interruptions to U.S. import operations. Next slide, please. A distinctive feature of COVID-19 is that it prompted countries to impose both import and export restrictions. We hadn't seen that in a long time, at least for an extended period of time. Of all the countries that American companies source product, India was clearly the country identified the most with restricting the export of product. Next slide, please. As the measures to dampen the outbreak of COVID-19 lasted over the weeks of the survey, companies faced the increased likelihood of losing customers. And then in the graph on the right, of all the modes of transportation, air transport experienced the biggest change as countries ended passenger air flights, which also carried cargo. Next slide, please. As the chart shows on the left, the impact of COVID-19 was immediately felt by U.S. companies. American companies reported taking a number of steps to reduce reliance on countries affected by COVID-19, and most notably building up inventory of product and searching for product from other countries. Now, I'll just conclude on an interesting note. The U.S. economy is less trade dependent than many other economies like Germany. So I think only about 13% of the U.S. economy is affected by international trade. But as you see from those statistics and those trends, most companies were greatly impacted because of inputs that they couldn't get from source countries. So this was an interesting experiment to see the impact on global trade and the U.S. in particular.
Thank you, Marianne. I'd like to now perhaps turn to Nicole. Nicole, and based on I want to talk to you about risk and looking at Marianne's presentation. You know, one of the most prominent themes that emerged from this pandemic, and again, as evidence from Marianne's presentation, is the vulnerability of supply chains, right? And we saw it particularly in the case of supply chains related to pharmaceuticals and medical equipments, and that includes also, of course, PPE, et cetera. And, you know, major consultancies, Kinsey, BCG, et cetera, and even as evidence, as I said, by Marianne's member survey, they highlighted that risk is a key determinant for companies as they rebuild or reorganize or simply re-engage their supply chains as we adapt to a post-COVID-19 environment. Can you tell us perhaps how are businesses assessing risk now? Are we seeing a trade-off between risk and efficiency in the way companies are assessing with the risk.
Well, thank you, Raul. And I really appreciated seeing that data, Marianne. It really mirrors what we're seeing with our client base. Kroll Associates and our parent company, Duff & Phelps, represent or consult with global companies, global manufacturing companies, companies that really rely on global supply chains in order to do their manufacturing operations around the world. Even if they are based in the U.S. and most of their manufacturing is done in the U.S., as Marianne indicated, many inputs come from around the world. So when COVID-19 hit, to the extent that we had clients who did not have diversified supply chains, if they kind of in some ways put all of their eggs in one basket, many of them in China, they found that there was stress in their ability to continue to maintain their operations no matter where they were based, because they couldn't get the inputs that they needed. And so, there's that risk component. If you kind of put your eggs in one basket, all in one basket, and there is an interruption like we saw in the early days of COVID-19, it does stress your manufacturing operations. But then there's also risk associated with that diversification that I'm talking about. And, and many companies are looking to do that now because, they realize that it's important in order to kind of hedge their bets, so to speak. And so, there have been some winners in this shifting. Vietnam has certainly been a beneficiary of some of the shifts in supply chains globally. I think that India is well positioned to be a beneficiary. So there are countries that are trying to move up the value chain as it relates to supply chains now. China has been very dominant in this regard. They have built up processes, and it's going to take some time for other countries to do the same. But I think that this is an opportunity for other countries, and particularly countries within the Western Hemisphere, to begin to look at ways to position themselves, particularly as it relates to U.S.-based companies, as they consider, nearshoring, to be able to compete in the supply chain shifts that we're seeing. And then the last piece that I'd say about risk that our clients are very mindful of is reputational risk associated with diversifying their supply chains. Because, as we know, there are corruption risks around the world with respect to, complying with the FCPA, UK Bribery Act, and other regimes that are attempting to curb corruption and disincentivize corruption. And so as companies are evaluating new supply chain partners, they really have to do due diligence to ensure that, they aren't, putting themselves in jeopardy because they are working with companies that don't have the kinds of, kind of corruption, kind of, I guess, preventative measures within their companies that may result in a backlash to the companies that then begin to partner with them. And so that's something that I know that SIPE works with countries around the world who are seeking to get into supply chains to address. And that's something that, our clients are looking at very closely as they assess their risk.
Thank you, Nicole. If I may, I want to stick with a point that you raised, and perhaps it's for you and Marianne. So essentially, is what you're saying then that companies are taking a second look at the way they do inventory, for example? Because if you're talking about a shift to, if there is indeed risk in diversification, which I think is a fascinating proposition, and their companies are opening themselves to all sorts of other kinds of risk possibilities, including reputational risk that you were saying, that means that it makes sense for companies to then build redundancies so that they can mitigate. Is that what you're seeing among your clients and your members, Marianne? Are companies embracing this? And I say this because, for example, in conversations that we have had with members from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in terms of the macro trade policy environment, there's that saying, better the devil you know. And so in some ways, they're sticking with, for lack of a better term, China. I mean, that could mean any other country, but sticking with that type of efficiency because the gains are still there. So are we seeing a shift in the way that companies are thinking about inventory? You're muted.
Marianne's on mute.
Good question. You know, at the beginning of the year, I started trying to get data. I was doing polling when I would do presentations, and I would ask people about production shifting. And at that time, anybody that I polled, they were trying to gather information. And then the pandemic hit, and I really didn't get a lot of data. People were just scrambling. Yesterday, we had a panel at our conference that was really interesting on origin, production shifting. And like most things in international trade, the canary in the coal mine is always the apparel and footwear, you know, because they have, you know, the highest duties in the United States. They tend to have the lowest margins among goods processed around the world. And we did have a CEO of a company who owns their own manufacturing in China. And what we saw, what he talked about, what others talked about, which is really interesting to me, is people are now making a decision, are we all in China, or are we going to move out of China? And the problem that people have faced, which is a unique aspect of the U.S. China relationship, is the U.S. is a big consumer market, and China is a big production market. And even if you go to Vietnam, Malaysia, other countries, they don't necessarily have the capacity, the production capacity to fulfill those orders of the size that is required. The other thing that was interesting, people talked about, again, going to the apparel companies as the canary in the coal mine, a lot of companies switched very quickly to making PPE equipment, which is challenging, but the message was be nimble. The bigger problem that we're seeing are those companies that have regulated supply chains, whether you're in the chemical industry, regulated by EPA, FDA, you've got a bigger problem because you need some kind of U.S. government or perhaps foreign government certification of a manufacturing facility, the supply chain, et cetera. And that's been a much more difficult. And one of the questions that I posed to the panelists is it almost a form of regulatory arbitrage to be nimble in getting your permits and requests into agencies and get that done sooner than your competitors? So it's a really interesting landscape, and I don't have a specific trend line or storyline to give you.
Nicole, maybe some thoughts, and perhaps, and that's part of the equation, right? We are in a shifting landscape. There is no concluding evidence, but it is important to take stock of some of these changes, particularly because we are talking about a tremendous amount of competition coming from places, for example, FTA partners of the United States that are positioning themselves as nearshoring destinations. We have a new agreement, USMCA, and what that means in those senses. So it really does depend about those supply chains. Nicole, perhaps some thoughts in that respect.
Sure. So I think that the COVID-19 tragedy is probably, I would say it's helpful with respect to the North American region and USMCA being a big component of kind of creating some competitiveness for the region. And I think that there will be more emphasis on trying to figure out how North America as a region can consolidate its supply chains, given the fact that we do have USMCA, which, you know, really upgraded NAFTA and really incorporated a lot of the more modernized provisions that were contemplated in the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. So I think that there's an opportunity there. I'd also say that there is, what we're seeing with our clients is a tension between kind of the efficiencies around just-in-time kind of supply chains versus, you know, trying to stockpile inventory, which I think you referenced earlier, Raul. I think that, you know, again, we're in kind of, it's shaky ground right now. companies have suffered, you know, when they relied on just-in-time supply chains. Many of them suffered, you know, particularly when they were in China, and at the time that, you know, China was shut down, the inputs that were necessary weren't available. So I think that, you know, I think that companies are a little uncertain about kind of where to focus their investment in supply chains right now. And again, to the point that Marianne made, there has to be the capacity in these other countries, in these third countries. And, you know, China has been at this a long time. They have perfected the capacity piece of this puzzle, and it's going to take some time. And so, you know, some of our clients are looking at certain countries and saying, look, we're going to double down. We're going to start now. And, you know, I think that's a really interesting point about the regulatory arbitrage issue, Marianne, particularly given, you know, if it's a highly regulated industry, you know, be it pharmaceuticals or even, you know, automotive. I mean, anything that the U.S. government or other countries are regulating, you really have to be careful, and you've got to start early. And so I think that there are going to be a lot of strategic decisions being made by companies as they consider their plans, you know, B, C, and D in the event that something like this happens again.
Thank you, Nicole. Absolutely. Camila, let me turn to you and discuss free trade zones. You know, for those of us who are up to, you know, work knee deep in trade issues, we know FTZs play a significant role in global supply chains. And in fact, they also play a huge role in many governments' plans for how to successfully insert their economies in those chains. Now we have all of this talk about shifting supply chains, the collapse of global trade. We're seeing BCG estimated a 20% drop in global trade in 2020 and a recovery in a slightly optimistic scenario of 2023. So how are free trade zones coping with this type of environment? I mean, what are the near future and midterm prospects for free trade zones in the midst of all of this adaptation of global supply chains?
Yeah. Well, thank you, Jose, and to my panelists, and for the invitation of the Center of International Private Enterprise. And it's a really good opportunity for us to be here because the free trade zones are not very known. And that's why I'm here to show you a little bit of facts. I know in the US, there are the foreign trade zones. And in the rest of Latin America, we have free trade zones, special economic zone, and well, you find them with different names, but they're industrial parks with manufacturing, services, and logistics. To give you an idea, there are 630 free trade zones in the region, counting all Latin America and the Caribbean, with 10,800 companies from different areas. Footwear, plastics, medical devices, all logistics, everything you can, all industries are in the free trade zones. So for us, the COVID-19 has been a really good opportunity. It has been a speed up for us. We have been talking many times about this nearshoring, reshoring. Personally, I tell you this little story. I used to live in China for 10 years ago. And when I worked there, which was in the Investment Promotion Agency of Colombia, they told me to do a study of those products that can be done in Latin America to be exported to the US due to the advantages of transport costs, tariffs, taxes, and everything. I got to 200 products that we told to the companies, but at that time, no one paid attention. It was too early, and they were in their comfort zone. They were like, it's China, we're okay here. So, well, 10 years after, they're finally paying attention to this study that, of course, we need to do to change the kind of products that were discovered at that time. But the message is that finally we're getting an opportunity to really be the best place to be for the investment. I know from what Marianne was saying that there's a concern of capacity, However, I want to give you some figures. 56% of the total exports of Dominican Republic are exported from the free trade zones, 56%. The GDP, the total GDP of Costa Rica, 8% is made of the free trade zones of Costa Rica. And in Panama, just one free trade zone, Panama Pacifico, represents 2% of the GDP of Panama. So we are the best clusters to get all these new investments from the reshoring for the, well, we're not talking any longer about global value chains, we're talking about regional value chains. And it has, at least for me and people that are in trade, I guess, it has more sense to be closer in the same region, take advantage of the free trade agreements, because we have free trade agreements with the U.S., and do also all these regional value chains with rules of origin to get to the U.S. So, I mean, of course, people still rely on China. It's going to take time, but that's why we're here, to show you that the free trade zones are the best place to locate. And I'm really convinced. Just one thing that really I want you to take into your mind when we leave this webinar is that we're the safest place. So we are being authorized economic operators in some countries. In the others that we're not, we're working with the customs to become authorized economic operators. With this virus, meanwhile, the whole economy was locked down. For example, in Bogota and in Colombia, the free trade zones. Meanwhile, the whole country was in a lockdown. The free trade zones were in a 40% of production. Meanwhile, outside of the free trade zones, they were even closed. But because we have this extraterritoriality, I don't know what to say, to being outside of the national territory, we can control. And secondly, this control is giving us the opportunity to be COVID-19 free. So it's an area that we can start to control COVID-19, because we have to control all the entrance and exit of the merchandise, but also of the people. So for us, it has been an eye, like they really opened the eyes for many projects that we were talking. We were talking about e-commerce since 3 years ago, because in our legislation, we cannot do it. And suddenly it's like the whole world is doing e-commerce. So we have to speed up all the legislation to do e-commerce in our free trade zone. And well, all the blockchain the programs of blockchain that we said, okay, if it's produced in China, then how we're going to get to the industrial park and then to the final consumer. And we were like starting to understand blockchain. Now it's a reality. There's 2 free trade zones that are working on the blockchain project. So to be honest, well, COVID-19 has brought many negative things to the world, but also we need to see the positive part. And for the free trade zones, it has been a tremendous opportunity.
Thank you, Camila. And just, I would like to, before following up with you, I want to encourage our audience to please submit your questions to us via chat. We really look forward to hearing from you. Camila, so what you're saying in a sense is that the free trade zone model is essentially the best place to not only to take advantage of the current circumstance, but essentially to be adaptable to the changes that we are seeing in free trade zones. Is there anything that the zones are doing or are particularly interested in pursuing strategically to prepare for any additional changes? I know you've mentioned blockchain, you've mentioned some of even the public health risks that other types of businesses have in a country that are mitigated in free trade zones. Anything in particular that the zones are doing in response to, again, even questions of renationalization or taxes or other kinds of things to position the zones better for a post-COVID-19 trade environment?
Yeah. Well, particularly in our association, working on a website, which is going to be called relocatelatam.com. It's not ready yet. It's going to be in 20 days, where we're going to show all the warehouses available for depending manufacturing services or even BPO, KPO, ITO for the companies. So depending on the industry and if they want to rent or they want to buy, in which country, and the kind of incentives they're looking for, they will look forward. So that's an initiative that we are doing within our association to give all the in like a one-stop place where they can see all the offer of the free trade zones, and in country by country. Well, the ministries of trade are becoming more aware about the importance of the free trade zones regime. So before, we didn't have that much members like of ministries of trade that are members of the association. And now we're having the ministries of trade being members of the association, which is giving us a really good sign, because it's different that free trade zones go abroad and say, hey, we're the best place to invest by their own. But if they can go with the Ministry of Trade and they have this backup information from the Ministry of Trade, it gives a really good sign to the investor. So that's something that we're really seeing, that the ministries of trade are paying more attention to the free trade zones, because they saw the potential and all. It was the only part of the economy that it was moving. And as Marianne was saying, some of the companies that were doing textiles, they started doing the mask. So it was an industry that really changed their pattern really fast. And well, the e-commerce that I told you, it's not allowed to do e-commerce in the free trade zones. So we are moving forward to do the legislation easily, more accessible for the e-commerce platforms, which was not available before. And in particular, every country and every free trade zone is reinventing. And especially they're trying to find the cluster. There was something very interesting for these years that I've seen in the free trade zone, and is that they try to attract investment from different companies, but not with a main focus. So it was all kind of companies that you can see within the free trade zone. With these, we're starting to see more the cluster of medical devices free trade zone. So it's going to be more specialized there, and more collaboration within the free trade zones. There's giving more information. We have been working to make them more together, to share information, best practices. So this has been a really good exercise for them to share, okay, if this industry is not good for you because of the logistics, I'm too far from the port, or maybe it's better that is in your free trade zone. They're starting to be more open with information and with the clients, instead of just taking this client and maybe it's not the best place for this client. But now they were not going to tell him, because at the end they want to attract the free trade, the client. But now we're seeing more cooperation, and they're understanding that, well, if it's medical devices, okay, go to Costa Rica, go to Dominican Republic, where they already have everything. If you want logistics, okay, a port in Panama. If you want close to the port in Panama, if you want to deliver in South America, go to a port in Ecuador. So we're seeing this collaboration more and more. And in my association, one of my goals is to make them together and to understand that if we collaborate more, and we can actually do these regional value chains, because in the value chains there's zero tariff, and you can start doing all the regional value chains.
Thank you, Camila. We have a few questions, and many of them pertaining to the next subject that we're going to talk about, which is on the matter of how trade is conducted. But before we go there, I have a question from one of our from our audience. How are you seeing the impact of COVID-19 on energy trade, and the question, for example, of demand for renewable installations or LNG, or has this had any kind of impact on energy, on the role energy plays in international trade and the trade of energy itself? Takers? All right, let me make a...
Raul, let me just say, you know, the only observation I would make there is I started compiling a list of legislation and executive orders by the president restricting the supply chains, and energy is one of them. The power grid is one of them. And it was a curiosity. And I happened to talk to a member of our trade lawyer who just left the White House. And I asked her about it. And she said, you know, the administration was focused on 5 areas, you know, medical supplies, you know, but energy was one of them, and securing our supply chain and protecting the power grid. So it was a curiosity, and I don't have any greater insight than that, but I think it's an area to watch.
Absolutely. So let me turn attention for a moment to the way that we're conducting trade. We've talked about trading partners. We've talked about trading patterns. We talked about clients and risk. But I want to talk about the mechanics of trade itself. You know, one of the things that has been remarkable, and again, from my perspective as Deputy Director of the Global Alliance for Trade Facilitation, one of the things that we have seen tremendously is how many governments, customs authorities, and others have embraced technology, particularly digital solutions for customs and border compliance. In fact, they've done so with an unprecedented sense of urgency. And you know, there's that saying, never let a good crisis go to waste, in a manner of speaking. You know, so let me ask you, Marianne and Nicole in particular, and perhaps to be a bit blunt, has the crisis made things better in the sense of customs compliance? And how much of this, if it has, right, how much of this is permanent or something provisional, and how is business responding to these changes? Marianne, perhaps we can start with you. I know that you've been following, particularly in the case of the United States, how our own government follows or has adapted to digital solutions, but certainly in general, in terms of the entire world.
Yeah.
What are you seeing in that respect?
You know, we have been working on these ideas for quite a while. The United States has a long history, going back 30 years when I started in the industry, of automation. The U.S. was a leader in many ways. And we fell behind, I think. And ironically, Nicole, when she was at the government, you know, I signed a memorandum of understanding, you know, for promotion of e-commerce and a partnership agreement. And what's interesting is that, you know, in the 1990s, there was a real effort to automate, and it came out of Al Gore's Reinventing Government. You know, U.S. Customs was one of the first agencies that embraced using the internet as a way to better serve the trade community, or what they viewed as their customers. And that happened in a shift in the law of the Customs Modernization Act that passed in 1993 as part of NAFTA. But it was followed by a new view of how to inform the trade community about what the law is and how they were going to enforce it, informed compliance. You know, they went to a different model, okay, an audit-based model. And that lasted up until recently. I mean, certainly was impacted by 9/11. And so we had to take into account new risks in the supply chain and how the government viewed risk. So in the 1990s, you had the internet as a basic platform and the use of data, large chunks of data. We went through the dot-com bubble of a lot of companies developing these global trade management companies. And they went through a winnowing process. And now there's probably around, you know, I would say 4 to 5 major global trade management companies. it's almost like we're in that second revolution because we have a new set of trade tools. We mentioned blockchain is just one. I think one of the big, not innovations, but new entrants, obviously, are the e-commerce platforms. And if you listen to a presentation by any of the e-commerce companies to a trade audience, the first thing they will say is, we are technology companies. They never characterize themselves as, we're traders and stuff like that. They'll call themselves a marketplace, but they are primarily data companies and platform companies. The reason I think they are so significant is because they look at trade differently than we do. They have economies of scale, but they are always looking for a technological solution to issues. And they don't ask, what do we have to do in terms of compliance? They ask, why are we doing it this way? So the question that I always ask to people in our industry is, do you believe that e-commerce has changed international trade? And I think the answer is yes. And the second question I ask them is, do you think e-commerce is going to change trade compliance? And I think the answer is yes. Because what we saw in the 1990s is the idea of trying to program all the trade rules into an IT system. But trade laws change so much, the regulations change so much, you still need knowledgeable people to really run that system. It's still somewhat people intensive. That I think is going to change because the tools are much more sophisticated. And it's not just one of these trade tools. It's not just about blockchain. It's blockchain coupled with machine learning and artificial intelligence, the combination of these tools, and then using the economies of scales of the e-commerce marketplaces, that I think you'll see a tipping point and will really change trade compliance.
That's a really good point, Marianne. And I would add that I think that to the question you raised, Raul, is this going to last? I think the answer is yes. And I think that it will have other benefits, kind of spillover benefits as it relates to combating corruption. When you have digital paper trails in the trade process, I think that's helpful. As it relates to, avoiding kickbacks and those kinds of things. I think that there will be that benefit as well as it, begins to mature and really take hold. And then, there'll be some risks injected into that process as well, though, because when you're dealing with data, you have data security issues, and people need to be concerned around, cybersecurity, and ensuring that, again, as these systems roll out, they're secure.
Absolutely, Nicole. And let me stay with you for a second here, Nicole, because I want to revisit a point that certainly you and Marianne raised, and that I think is very important as we start looking at governments and the government response. And it's related to the question of all of the export restrictions that we started seeing and other emergency trade measures that were being introduced in the context of the crisis. They have raised concerns and in some cases fears, depending on who you talk to, that governments, that trade policy itself will change, right? That governments will seek to find some sort of balance or rebalance in a way what they have as global trade aspirations with other concerns like manufacturing, employment, other domestic concerns. And in your case, Nicole, you as a former assistant secretary for manufacturing, I'm sure you have you've seen that connection between international trade and domestic manufacturing and these kinds of policy dynamics. Taking into consideration these kinds of moves that you're seeing that Marianne was explaining on e-commerce and on how trade fundamentally is changing in some ways, how do you see these two dynamics merging, right? Do you see the future of trade policy moving in this direction, call it a more interventionist or activist role of governments in trade policy. And what does that mean for two things? One is obviously for businesses, how do they respond to this? But also to this question of accountability and transparency in trade policy. Once you have that shift of priorities in the trade landscape.
Well, protectionism is always a concern in trade policy, and we're seeing a lot of that now because the fear of kind of not having adequate supplies to support your citizens in a health crisis. I mean, it's caused countries, and we even see in the EU, they issued a directive around that. They were very careful to try to thread the needle to say that, this doesn't mean we don't have an open trade environment, but we have to take care of our people, kind of thing. And so I think that, we have to be mindful of creeping protectionism that will distort trade relationships and trade policy. And I think we also have to be careful of kind of this national security exception taking over, because again, I think that, that's there. Certainly countries have the right to protect their citizens, but if you begin to use national security as a tool of tradecraft, so to speak, kind of as a blunt instrument in kind of the trade policy kind of alignment around the world, I think that's going to be a problem. So it's something to look at. I think that, we need to be careful that, these stresses that we've seen don't kind of turn the clock back as it relates to global trading rules and kind of the kind of collective prosperity that I think opening up markets has created around the world. Thank you,
Nicole. Camila, I wanted to turn briefly to you and again, looking at this question of governments. I mean, you made a very interesting point about some of the approaches that trade ministries are taking to free trade zones, for example, and how companies or governments are starting to take a different look at the free trade zones in the context of COVID. I wanted to ask you a few questions in this sense. On the one hand, what kinds of incentives or policies are you seeing governments interested in pursuing? In the context of everything that we've spoken about, right, with reshoring, national interests coming into play in this situation, what kinds of policies are you seeing, maybe some of the most effective or less effective, that are being proposed to attract foreign investors and incentivize reshoring? But also, in parallel but separate, when you see government facing the kinds of fiscal crunches that they are facing after this crisis, do you see any kind of fiscal pressure coming from government in terms of how they relate to the FTZ regime? Or do you see any kind of consideration in that respect playing in some of these other government responses that you talked about?
Well, that's an excellent question, because at the end we want to attract and we want to give them incentives so that they come to the countries, but at the same time the governments need more fiscal. So what can I tell you about this topic is that right now we have incentives in almost all of the free trade zones in the Americas and the Caribbean start for the income tax. Depending on the country is 0%, mainly in Central America is 0% income tax. In other countries, it starts growing over the time for the income tax. And in Colombia is 20% of income tax, and outside the free trade zone is 33% of income tax. So the income tax will remain as one of the main incentives within the free trade zones. And well, with the fiscal pressure, it is our duty to show to the governments that we are a good business for the government. So we have been doing studies in 3 different countries, in Dominican Republic, Costa Rica, and Colombia, that in Dominican Republic, the number gave for every dollar that the government does not receive in this kind of taxes, income tax, tariffs, VAT, they receive 6 in exchange. So it's a relation of 1 to 6. In Costa Rica is 1 to 5.6. I mean $5.6. In Colombia is 1 to 3. And actually, we're doing it again. A consultant did a study, and he's going to present it really soon to give us an update of the number. So it's the way you show to the governments that we are okay. We have preferences, and we are with reduced taxes, but we're a good business for the economy. Because at the end, if you show to the government that a case of Dominican Republic, 160,000 employees in the free trade zone and 56% of the exports. And if they take the incentives, what are the companies going to do? They're not going to say, okay, we'll stay. Oh, we have we have other countries with incentives. So we are constantly talking with the governments that the free trade zones is a good business. And with these studies, they're understanding that it's going to be the most important tool to attract new investment, that there's nothing better than the free trade zones in order to attract. What are the main investment promotion agencies doing? Once they promote the country, they talk about free trade zones. Why? Because right now is the only mechanism in terms of incentives that you can find to attract new companies from abroad.
Sorry, I'm muting myself. Thank you for that response, Camila. I want to just ask a quick question with respect to some of the compliance aspects of the shifts in supply chains. And particularly to Marianne and Nicole, you both talked about, what are the calculations that companies are making with respect to shifts, and what kinds of interactions they have with government, export or foreign government requirements with respect to certain kinds of certifications, so on and so forth. So maybe can you talk a little bit about some of the compliance challenges that companies are finding as a result of COVID-19 as they shift their inventory practices and their supply chains, for example. Questions, I know, for example, one particular vexing issue for traders into the United States has to do with how to certify that your supply chain is free of child labor, which has always been a challenge because there is no foolproof certified way of doing that type of compliance. Are you seeing that type of challenge more present now, or prescient in terms of the COVID-19 crisis? And is reshoring or nearshoring an answer to some of those compliance issues?
Well, it's a really good question. And I think that, when I mentioned the risks earlier on, the reputational risk and kind of part of that, hand in glove with that is regulatory risk. Companies really need to do due diligence on the suppliers that they have. They're adding, actually existing suppliers in global supply chains need a constant kind of refresh in terms of that diligence, but certainly new members of the supply chain need that, because there are many certifications that are coming online in the United States and in other countries. And the only way that you can really address that is to do some level, probably a deeper dive than you might otherwise do in terms of due diligence, to understand child labor practices. Increasingly, certifications around environmental issues are coming online. And so how do you do that? I mean, you have to have the resources to do it. Many of our clients will hire us to do that, to kind of have a third party to do some of that work. There are ways to kind of automate it if you have a large volume, so that it's not supplier by supplier, and maybe to set up some recurring due diligence protocols. But it is an issue that is a reputational risk issue for companies, as well as a legal risk. And we've seen it, and it's funny, the reference, Marianne, to the canary in the coal mine, that apparel and footwear play. I mean, as we recall, and this is pre-COVID, the situation in Bangladesh and the collapse of the Rana Plaza there, and the number of folks that were killed. And yeah, there were lots of regulations on the books that the Bangladesh government had, but it was not, they weren't enforced. And there was blowback reputationally on many retailers in the West that were using their supply chain, included folks that were in Bangladesh in that situation. So I say all that to say that I think that what this is going to do is, kind of the fallout from COVID-19 and the need to expand supply chains. It's going to require additional diligence. Certainly, nearshoring and reshoring can help. Reshoring is an interesting phenomenon. There are cost issues associated with that. You really have to look at, weighing all of these factors. There may be higher costs, but less reputational and regulatory risk associated with a reshoring. As I mentioned before, the advantage of engaging within the North American supply chain, working with Mexico, working with Canada, working with the countries in the Western Hemisphere with whom we have free trade agreements, and having some certainty around that, because we do have a free trade agreement with a country. There are certain standards that have to be agreed upon by the countries. So I think that minimizes risk as well. So, this could be, to some extent, a boon for the Western Hemisphere, quite frankly. And I think that we, as companies begin to assess this risk, the reputational and regulatory risk, they will look to nearshore or reshore where appropriate.
Thank you, Nicole. Just one last question I wanted to ask with respect to small and medium-sized businesses. We've talked a lot about the ways in which global supply chains are readapting. You have small and medium-sized businesses that, for many countries, are the vehicle that they in turn try to work with to become better inserted in these global supply chains. And for many of us who work on trade and trade facilitation issues, digital technologies are a boon to SMEs. Because it makes the cost of doing trade across borders easier, and it's more accessible, and it does, and to something Nicole pointed very, very, very interestingly, it reduces a lot of the exposure that companies have to corruption or to other kinds of problems that certainly matter to everybody, but they can be life or death issues for small and medium-sized businesses. How are you seeing the landscape of SMEs in this changing environment of global supply chains? And even in the question, when we are talking about nearshoring or reshoring, for example, or any of the other measures that we are talking about, how do you see SMEs faring in this environment? And this question, again, for any of the panelists who may have a comment in that respect.
Well, let me try to answer it and go back to the previous question. If you were to ask me, what is the essence of the Trump trade policy? I would put it in a thumbnail sketch to say, what the Trump administration has done is it has raised the costs, or, we used to talk about externalities, right? It has forced companies to confront the true costs and risks of trading with China principally, but other countries around the world, to say, we're going to force you to pay those prices. There was a famous book many years ago called The China Price. And it was about how China had the economies of scale to undercut the price to manufacture goods. I think you're seeing the flip side of that, of the administration saying, we've got low rates, the, MFN and all of that, really lowered the rates, and we're subsidizing the exports of China and other countries around the world, and we're not going to do that anymore. And they're forcing, and Ambassador Lighthouse has said this bluntly in congressional testimony, most recently about a month ago to House Ways and Means and Senate Finance. And by creating uncertainty, what he has said, if you want to reduce your risks, manufacture in the United States. They've been blunt about it. with SMEs, if you are an SME engaged in trade, our biggest trading partners are still Canada and Mexico, particularly as an SME. And we've imposed tariffs on, for a variety of reasons, 301, 232, you got crushed. And now with COVID, and you still have to pay duties, and you've got 301 duties, high duties, and the market has dropped your consumers. You have gotten crushed. So much so that we've tried to get duty deferral, and that wasn't great what the administration came out with because it was so restrictive. And that's why SME, the one supply chain that has held up in COVID-19 is the e-commerce supply chain. And the United States had raised its de minimis to $800 in TIFTIA, passed in 2015, independent for a variety of other reasons that had nothing to do with e-commerce necessarily. So what traditionally had become an export platform and in the United States became an import platform. We've gone from, maybe having individual shipments come in to entire container loads of trucks crossing the Canadian-US border to now ocean carrier containers coming in with e-commerce. Transportation and trade are like water. It's going to find the most efficient route. And for a very long time, it took me a very long time to understand why e-commerce and the platforms were so successful. And what I realized is for a company selling a product, it is a transaction first. First of all, if you're an SME, if you've got a place where you can show yourself to the world, that you don't have to worry about finding customers, the customers are going to find you. Okay, so it flips it on its head. But more importantly, it's a transaction first and then an import-export second. That's handled behind the scenes. And that's why the platforms are so successful. So for SMEs, I think that, and even large companies, I know some large name brand companies that figured out within the last 2 to 3 years, they only need distribution centers to supply large brick and mortar retailers. And then they went totally to a e-commerce direct to consumer. And one company told me that they saved $150 million per year doing that. So if the big guys are figuring it out, the SMEs are figuring out that too. And that's why this is such an interesting period, because you have a bunch of things going on at the same time. Change in policy, a change in trade patterns, and then you have this pandemic that right in the middle, and that is going to spur, I think, a lot of innovation on every level.
Certainly, it certainly has. Folks, we have a few minutes left. If there are any other pressing questions that the audience may have, please a time to please submit those. If not, maybe from each one of you, if I could impose on you, maybe some final thoughts on anything that you want to leave us as an audience thinking about with respect to what this shifting landscape means for trade policy, for compliance, quite frankly, and for transparency and accountability in the way that we conduct our trade governance.
Well, I'll start just to say that, I think it's very important for companies to diversify their supply chains for sure, to maybe do some proactive planning around where to go and what it takes from a regulatory standpoint, as Marianne had mentioned, to be in compliance if you do have products that are, heavily regulated, really giving yourself lead time in order to ensure compliance there. And then, there's risk that needs to be managed that is reputational as well. And so it's very important to have a robust diligence program as it relates to your existing suppliers and any future suppliers, so that you can protect yourself both from a corruption standpoint, any kind of reputational risk can be mitigated by in instituting a very robust program like that. But if this virus has taught us nothing else, it certainly taught us that you can't have all your eggs in one basket. You really need to leverage global supply chains in a way that that you can weather any kind of storm that comes that you may not be able to predict.
Thank you, Nicole. Camila, Marianne, anybody thoughts? Camila, perhaps?
Well, the world has changed, definitely. And I don't believe that the companies should continue doing the things that they did before. Maybe it worked before being in China or being in Asia, but I truly believe that it's a time to look for our region. We're neighbors. We're in the same continent. We have incentives, as I told you. We have free trade agreements. So I really invite everyone to look to our region and see everything that we can do together instead of going to the other side. And to be honest, I told you, I lived in China. So I know China and I like China. It's not nothing against China, but just not to take me wrong. But I really believe that, but it's the time to get more into the Americas.
I would conclude, Raul, by saying, what does compliance mean? In the past, that was set by government. Government said, you must do X. You must have a tariff classification and a value, and this is how you determine it. And that's fine, that'll continue. But the one entity that we have not talked about, although Nicole alluded to it a little bit in terms of reputational risk, is what about consumers? The changing behavior of consumers will drive a lot of this. And I think consumers, particularly the millennials, are much more aware. We've been imposing those public values ever since 9/11. Prior to that, security meant loss and damage claims for, the supply chain. And then we got into the era of, product safety, after the Melamin got into, the Chinese products. Then we had the conflict minerals, okay? So that was another standard imposed. And now, forced labor. So in my conference, that has been the leitmotif of the conference, of the anxiety in the trade community. Again, we have another public value or humanitarian issue being imposed on the supply chain. And that's being enforced through customs. Even though that started in the 1980s with the retailers, and the Department of Labor really has the most expertise, once you get the guys with badges and guns, enforcing it, it takes on a different tenor. But I think the big shift is going to be consumer behavior, and the whole idea of compliance will no longer just be set by government standards, but by consumer expectations and that transparency. And so my hope in the future is, we'll be able to comply with the basic that the government set, the standards. But let's look at, do you know where your goods are produced and how? How do you value those goods? And all of the other things that go along with it. So it satisfies consumers' demand that products are produced in a decent way and that they feel good about their purchase. And that goes to the branding of a company, mission statement, and values. So I think companies are going to have to think long and hard about how they want to engage in global trade, and are they able to defend their product and their brand.
Certainly. And with those words, I'd like to thank, on behalf of my colleagues at SIPE and my personal behalf, I'd like to thank our three distinguished panelists and my boss, the CEO of SIPE, Andrew Wilson, for joining us in this conversation today. Very fortuitous, and stay tuned, because again, this is the first event in a series of events that the Trade Lab at SIPE will be putting out, not just to look at the response to the COVID-19 situation, but also the broader questions of trade governance as pertaining to some of the issues our panelists have raised. So thank you very much for joining us this morning, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.